I call the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I have a simple question for the Speaker who's just has roomed his seat. Is the Raymond Winston Peters signature on the government sale of Auckland International Airport in 1998 the same Winston Peters that has described this mixed ownership bill as treachery? I could not possibly believe, and let me, I looked up on the iPad. What did Mr. Peters say in 1998? Let me tell you. He said this: "We are very pleased with the most successful public sale. It is popular capitalism in action." And Mr. Speaker, I'd remind that member in the 2005 election. This is the same member who campaigned in 2005 on the mixed ownership model for KiwiBank. And I have to say, the double standards that has existed by that member are pretty extraordinary. But, Mr. Speaker, it goes even further than that. I checked the records of members opposite, and I was quite amazed to find that in 2007, the then Labour government sold for tens of millions of dollars 49% of the shares in the Spring Creek mine to American multinational Cargill Coal. Now, let's be clear. This was a state-owned company, 100%. This was an energy company. Actually, the sale specifically required Cabinet and ministerial approval. The documents have got the signature of the Minister of Finance, the Minister of SOEs, the Minister of Energy. It also required the signature of the Minister in charge of the Overseas Investment Office. And I also note that there are 14 members of the Labour front bench that sat in the Cabinet room and approved that sale and can now have the audacity to somehow use extravagant phrases like treachery for exactly the same policy with other companies. And that just shows, Mr. Speaker, how shallow is a bird bath members are opposite on this particular issue. But, Mr. Speaker, it gets even better than that. After Labour loses the 2008 election, we had a wonderful speech in 2010. And let me quote it. It's from Labour's finance spokesperson. It was to the Institute of Policy Studies here in Wellington. And he said this: "In a capital-constrained environment, Labour will better leverage the Crown's balance sheet in new and innovative ways. We need to unleash SOEs to create and grow them with private partners and private shareholders." Private partners and private shareholders, and that was David Cunliffe, the spokesperson for economic development for the Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, the policy of mixed ownership, and I agree with David Cunliffe's comments in that regard, it is good policy, it's rational, it's what we do in every one of our lives. This mantra of no asset sales is just that, it's not a policy. If the country adopted, Mr. Speaker, a policy of no asset sales ever, there would be no property market, there would be no trade me, there would be no share market. Indeed it would be. Indeed it would be. And we even had the experience last night, Mr. Speaker. Last night in the Parliament, one of my colleagues brought a bill to the House that would allow an area of land to be sold by a council so that they could subdivide it and sell it, and that they could use the proceeds to reduce debt and invest in other council and community investments. And every party in this Parliament voted for that bill. And I just simply say that exposes the absolute nonsense of the no asset sales mantra. And then let me hear the other argument in the House today, and it's been this: if the government can get a better return on a business than what it costs to borrow money, then it should own the business. That's the logic. So I say, right, average returns on the share market have been 7%. Government pays about 4% for its money. What the government should do is then, to reduce its deficit, borrow heaps and have heaps of debt. And in fact, at the last election, Labor went to the country and said, we're going to borrow $10 billion. We're going to invest that and get a rate of return of 7%. We're only going to pay 4% on the borrowings, and on that basis we can close the deficit. Well, if you take that logic to its conclusion, Mr. Speaker, why don't we go borrow $100 billion? Or $200 billion? Or why not go the whole hog and take $1 trillion? Because on that way we could instantly get rid of the deficit and solve the country's worries, and I simply say it is a nonsense. You see, governments, just like households, need to be cautious of debt levels. We've set a cap of our debt not going greater than 30% of GDP. It's a prudent level that gives the capacity for New Zealand to absorb future economic shocks. This mixed ownership model is crucial to keeping those limits. It enables us to use those billions of dollars to be able to invest back in the economy with things like broadband, like the new research institute, like water storage, like transport infrastructure, without having to alternatively borrow billions overseas. But there's another part of which I have to say opposition members' financial illiteracy really does stun me. Let's clear the line. Why should people have to pay to buy shares in companies they already own? That's what they've said. What an extraordinary comment of ignorance. So, for instance, if a State House tenant wants to buy the house of the government, these guys say, oh, they shouldn't have to pay for it because they already own it. And I checked with the government's transactions. Each year, the government sells hundreds of buildings and hundreds of hectares of land. Are members opposite really saying, well, if I buy some land off the government, I shouldn't have to pay for it because I already own it? I've never heard of such economic lunacy, and yet that is the argument that is put up by members opposite. I've also got to reflect on the issue of power prices, because let's just check the record. During Labor's period of government, power prices went up by 8% compound. 8% compound. The Minister of Energy under this government, Jerry Brownlee, rightly recognised that there was not effective competition in the electricity market, and in the years since, the increases have dropped to less than half of that. But I say this to the Greens and to other parties opposite. It's time you're honest with the public. I have heard the Labor Minister of Finance and the Greens repeatedly say that they are going to get rid of subsidies under the emissions trading scheme. You know what that really means? That really means that if they are elected at the next election, they are going to sock power consumers with very significant price increases against the policies that this government has. Mr. Speaker, I want to end on the last issue of mandate. Mr. Speaker, over the last 25 years, there was a big batch of share sales in the 1980s, including by people like Trevor Mallard, Annette King, Phil Goff and those members. Mr. Speaker, I've checked the parliamentary record. Do you know what happened with those bills? They never went to a select committee. There was absolutely no electoral mandate, and they went bang one of them for a sale of asset, went through this parliament under urgency, first, second, third readings, absolutely no select committee stage. Mr. Speaker, in the second period and during the course of the 1990s, there were businesses like Auckland International Airport, a shareholding in Wellington Airport, businesses like Contact Energy. And in that stage, the process did not have a very clear electoral mandate. Mr. Speaker, any honest assessment of the history is that there has been a more open, upfront and honest policy about the sale of these shares than at any time in more than a generation. The reality is that the policy was announced in January of 2011. The public had a very clear choice at the election. The select committee process was open and thorough. In fact, I have to commend my colleagues on the tolerance that they showed at the select committee. And while members opposite will say that every single little branch of the Labor Party made a submission. What they don't say is that 29 chambers of commerce, representing 34,000 businesses, came to the committee unanimously saying that they supported this bill. It makes good economic sense, it keeps debt down, it's about making the New Zealand economy more competitive, and this House should support this bill.
I call the honourable member Dr.